Welcome you to a colloquium. It's now December 8th, 2010, Wednesday morning, 589 Fifth Avenue, right opposite Rockefeller Center. We have a colloquium on Summa Metaphysica, the two-book series, God and Evil and God and Good. God and Evil was published in 1988. God and Good was published in 2008. We have with us Professors Lauren Schiffman and Micah Gottlieb, currently at NYU and Princeton respectively this year. Okay, so the ground rules are there's no holds barred, nothing is off the table, and logic and truth are the supreme ultimate goals here. So I'd like to start off with throwing out to these distinguished professors, getting rolling. What are some components of Summa Metaphysica which might have intrigued you? Let me start with Professor Schiffman.
Well, in rereading the second volume, I've been kind of intrigued by this idea of God realizing his potential for a variety of reasons. Normally we assume in Jewish philosophy, which has been very much influenced by Aristotelianism, and also Jewish mysticism is actually very much influenced through Maimonides by Aristotelianism. We assume that it's not really possible for God to change. And it appears that if you speak about a God who's reaching his own potential, that there's some kind of a progress that's going on of within God or something like that. And normally this would be considered to be rather, let's be honest, strange. Now, in this case, it seems like it's an extension somehow of the overall assumptions of Volume 1 that the growth of the human enterprise and of the world around us is really playing out one's potential. But with the divine, it's a rather original idea and needs some clarification.
Professor Gottlieb?
Well, I think what I was struck, first of all, with Volume 1 is the real profound optimism in the book. You're facing the issue of evil, and the Holocaust is clearly a very important component of this. It's kind of prime in your mind, and what I was struck by was this profound sense of optimism about human potentiality, human potential, and also really this kind of faith in human progress, which I think, is a very bold move to make, and I think a lot of people have shied away from embracing the notion of progress after the Holocaust, and I think that comes out even more strongly in Volume 2, where, again, just to repeat what Professor Schiffman said, that again this idea of the progress and the development of the individual's capacities then is given this kind of cosmic dimension, which actually, there are roots. You see this kind of concept in German philosophy and Lessing, Hegel, things like this, and thinkers like this. But it's kind of interesting to bring this into the Jewish context.
So, first, my plan is to touch base with Professor Schiffman about his thoughts. I want to get back to you. Maybe you can extrapolate a little bit of vis-a-vis, even minimally, vis-a-vis Lessing and Hegel, how they might dovetail into this, or how I might dovetail into them. Fair enough? So, we have to be careful, we know, we have to play by the rules. So, yes, Professor Schiffman, yes, I would say that normative Orthodox Jewish dogma would bristle at the concept of an evolving divine. And respectfully, and you're not challenging the genuineness of my metaphysics. You're pointing out that it might not be consonant. You're implying it might not be consonant with normative Orthodox Jewish dogma, and you're right. I agree. And I feel that there's a whole discussion: is there even a mainstream Jewish metaphysics, or is there just a theology detached from foundation metaphysics, which would be my position, which I suspect, without putting you on the spot, might be your position. Okay. But back to your point, I feel that, and I've wrestled with this issue. You see, and you're correct, Book 1 is very meticulously careful to be within the boundaries of classic mainstream Jewish dogma. And it's stamped, sealed, approved by a roster of Orthodox rabbis as well. With Book 2, which was written roughly 15 to 20 years later, I decided to start with a blank slate and detach from any dogma or theology and see where this path took me. Luckily for me, it dovetails well with Book 1. However, it diverges from classic contemporaneous Orthodox dogma.
But see, the question that I would be concerned about is not whether it diverges from somebody's dogma, but whether or not the reason that that dogma was developed is philosophically necessary. Okay?
Right.
Now, that's the question which actually Professor Gottlieb probably knows more than I do about. However, my understanding is that the reason why some of these conclusions were reached in the Middle Ages, and even earlier by Aristotle, is because actually they're logically correct. Now, this is not always true, because sometimes they're built on assumptions that we no longer accept. But sometimes they seem to be logically correct. And the question is how you can define, if you define a change in God, so therefore you have an imperfect God. So the question is,
I have an evolving
not
God.
yet perfect God.
I have an evolving perfection.
Yeah, okay.
I have an evolving perfection. And on some level, it enters the realm of semantics. Can perfection be evolving? And you can have 400 university courses on that subject. Can perfection be evolving? Okay. And remember, the Torah says there is a God. The Torah does not say there's a perfect God. One should not have a heart attack at that statement. But one can make a case that the God of Israel does make adjustments, and the God of Israel never self-asserts that the God of Israel is perfect. If we say that perfection means non-evolvement, so this becomes evolvement. But getting back to your main point, we tend to hold Aristotle, Maimonides on a very high pedestal, whereas respectfully, their metaphysics are fatally flawed, demonstrably fatally flawed. And there are major gaps in their respective metaphysics. And if they were so strong, they would be more prominent today. So what do I mean by that? From my humble perspective, as your humble, erudite student, metaphysics need to address certain key points. And I call these grand philosophy points, also known as the questions 5 or 7-year-olds ask, but never get answers to. Okay, here's some of the basic questions. If there is a God, if there's a classic God of Israel, where did this God come from? If there's a classic God of Israel, why is there a Holocaust? If there's a classic God of Israel, why have you and I never directly encountered this God of Israel? And if there's a classic God of Israel, where is this all heading? Next, on the other side of the ledger, if there is no God or no classic God of Israel, where did the cosmos come from? If there is no God, why is there a cosmos? If there's no God, where is the cosmos headed? And whether or not there is a God, why is there gross evil? So from my humble perspective, neither Aristotle nor the towering Maimonides and all deal with these issues adequately, or even from
that isn't exactly the question. I'll explain to you why.
Okay.
Because the question is, on some of this, whether or not the points made on a particular issue are correct. Now, there's no question that when you read the Bible and you read the Midrash, and certainly when you read Jewish mystical literature, there are, let's call it, changes of mind of God. There are reactions to newer circumstances. There are even things that you would call, if you didn't have some kind of theological baggage, errors or mistakes in the way the narrative tells it. Okay. But that isn't exactly the issue, because of all the questions you raised, there's one that sticks out from all the others, and that's, where does God come from? Now, of all these questions that you mentioned, in each one of them, we could argue the particular issue one way or another, and it wouldn't necessarily matter. But the question of where does God come from would. Now, according to, unless I misunderstand,
so explain that. Why does that stand out?
Because basically, the classical assumption was always that God has always been there, and that God pre-exists that which He created. Because it's logically impossible for God to create something which existed before. Now, that might not be true if you live in a time. And admittedly, this gets to a whole question that we have to address sometime, that a lot of what we're talking about is how we understand things around us and not what they really are. Okay. However, the point is that those assumptions, at least within the way most of us talk when we mention a God, are actually correct assumptions. Because we assume that the God, and I believe you write this, is essentially the creator of the universe. Now, if that's the case, if that's the answer to the kid's question that you mentioned, somehow or another, even if we don't know how, then if the potential is developing of God over time, then it had to have a starting point. If it doesn't have a starting point, then it doesn't seem to make any sense that it developed from A to B. So therefore, if there has to be a starting point, right, that's what you need to explain. You need to explain how that there is a starting point. Now, one other point about this, which is that in a certain sense, the reason that this question differs from all of the other questions is because classically, at least in the whole Western religious tradition, it is like so fundamental. Something that you can say it's wrong, I don't agree with it, that's fine. But you do have to address it.
I agree with you 1,000 trillion%. Okay, I'm going to come back to you with your permission after Professor Gottlieb perhaps fleshes out some of his remarks before.
Right.
Might be able to explain some of mine better than I do.
Well, actually, I would want to maybe come down from the lofty heights of metaphysics down to politics and maybe even religious polemics, because I think that there has been classically a strong resistance on the part of many Jewish thinkers to embrace the notion of the progressive development of humanity. And the reason for that is, well, you can really talk about it in sort of two directions. One is in terms of the sense that this is an adaptation of a Christian argument, that the sense of supersession, the sense that the later generations understand more than the earlier generations, and that the question is, and that's always among Jewish thinkers has been a very problematic position, something that they've resisted. The second question has to do with the second issue has to do with the issue of God's justice, and the question is, if God is just, you might think that that should involve the idea that in every generation, people have an equal opportunity to perfect themselves. But the notion of kind of a progressive education of humanity seems to imply that people at later generations have more of an opportunity to perfect themselves, to fulfill themselves, I think is more the term that you use, than individuals in an earlier generation. And so that was seen by certain thinkers like Moses Mendelssohn as contravening divine justice, or divine goodness.
Okay, so you've opened up 300 discussions right there.
I just want to add one point about progress.